Every landscape photographer wants a 16-35 in their bag. So today we're going to be testing the Canon 16-35 f4 against the Sony. Now the nice thing about being a Sony shooter is that you can use other lenses other than Sony's with an adapter. So we're going to put this Sony 16-35, which is about $1,300 new, up against the Canon, which is about $300, $200, $300 cheaper depending on if you get it new or used.
If you are thinking of adapting a Canon lens to Sony, we tested two different adapters, the Comlight, which is about 90 bucks, versus the Metabones Mark IV, which is about 400 bucks. They both provide autofocus support, image stabilization, and aperture control, but the autofocus on the Metabones works better. If you watched our A7R II long-term review, it actually works better than you saw in that because Metabones has been kind enough to release some additional firmware updates since then.
So why don't we go test both of them and see which lens is better overall and which one is the better deal?
Let's do it. At 35mm and f4, as well as at higher f-stops, the Canon was far sharper at both the center and the edges of the image. At 16mm and f4, the Canon is much sharper at the center of the image. However, the Sony is sharper at the edges of the image. This held true for higher f-stop numbers too, and it's a little unusual. But wait, Ken Rockwell, I know Ken Rockwell, but he did a test comparing the Canon 16-35 on both the 5DSR and the A7R II, and he found that adapting the lens seemed to ruin corner sharpness. I repeated the same test, and yeah, the Canon lens on the Canon body is definitely sharper than the Canon lens on the Sony body. So how does the Canon 16-35 on the 5DSR compare to the Sony 16-35 on the A7R II? Scaled down to 42 megapixels, the Canon is sharper at the center and much sharper at the edges. This is all a huge bummer. The A7R II, with its small size, deep dynamic range, electronic viewfinder, and the ability to adapt any lens, it should be the ultimate landscapes camera. But the only native Sony superwide lens isn't that sharp. And you can adapt lenses, but it seems like you lose a lot of corner detail, at least at super wide focal lengths. Now before you say I got a bad copy, this is a loaner lens provided by Sony themselves and processed through Lens Rentals, and Lens Rentals does a very thorough job of testing every single lens. Also, the results are consistent with DxOMark's measurements. T-stops measure the actual light intensity hitting the sensor. It's what really determines your exposure rather than f-stops. The images from the Sony lens are about half a stop brighter than the Canon lens, indicating that Sony has a lower t-stop value. That's good news for people shooting with the Sony in low light. You could expose the Sony lens at ISO 400, while the Canon lens would need to be at ISO 600. In high contrast areas at the edge of the frame, chromatic aberration was a real problem for the Canon. Fortunately, I was able to remove it with Lightroom. Wide open, the darker corners of the Canon indicate that it has slightly more vignetting. This was also easy to fix in Lightroom. Want a second opinion on the sharpness? Check DxOMark's website. They showed that the Sony on the 36 megapixel A7R got just barely more detail than the Canon did on the 22 megapixel 5D Mark III. Should have gotten much more detail, especially since the Canon has an anti-aliasing filter on it. Even at 35 millimeters, the Canon actually beat the Sony for sharpness despite having fewer megapixels.
Oh. Well, the Sony E-mount is definitely more convenient, but since the Canon is sharper, I think that I would gravitate towards that, even with the adapter, just because I'd like to make large prints of my landscapes and I need it to be as sharp as possible.
Yeah, it's not that much more trouble to carry around.
Yeah.
If you want more honest, unbiased reviews, subscribe to our channel.
If they want to actually learn about taking landscape pictures, subscribe to our channel, or you can get our book, Stunning Digital Photography. And I think that's pretty much it.
It's a pretty good deal. Thanks, share, like.